Hi, this is Jennifer Pionk, and in this video tutorial I'm going to show you how to crochet the Triple Textures 12-inch Afghan square. For your square you'll need a worsted weight yarn, a 6mm crochet hook or whatever hook size you need to meet gauge, a pair of scissors, a couple of locking stitch markers, they may help you keep your place, a yarn needle, and a measuring tape. Go ahead and gather your supplies and we'll begin with the center 8-inch portion of the square. We're going to begin crocheting our triple texture square by working the center 8-inch square portion, and it is worked in rows back and forth. Then we'll add a short border of the same color just to prepare our edges, and then we'll add the final textured border. Some people, when they were making the square, decided they preferred the back side instead, and that's totally up to you. The square is kind of reversible. And I just showed you that I forgot to weave in a couple ends. Whoops. So I'm going to bring the camera in a little closer so you can see the textured portion better. This is the section we're going to be working on. So go ahead and get your yarn, a 6mm crochet hook or whatever size you're going to be using, and a couple of stitch markers. The very first thing we're going to do is to remove several yards of yarn from your ball or your skein. And we're going to let that lay loosely on a surface next to you or on your lap. The reason for doing so is that when you're working directly from the ball or pulling directly from the ball, it can create tension or a drag on your working yarn, and this can greatly affect the tension of your stitches. When you're working slip stitches, that can make a huge difference in your work. So go ahead and remove several yards. I'm going to work a small swatch instead of creating the entire width of the square. So if you want to make a swatch with me, go ahead and chain 15. We're going to begin with a slip knot on our hook, chain 15, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. If you're following along in the pattern, go ahead and chain what the pattern states, and that is 29. Now for row 1, we're going to be working into the back hump of the foundation chain. I often get asked, where's the back hump? So go ahead and look at your chain, look at the top, it looks like a top of a single crochet. You have 2 loops. There you have a front loop and a back loop. If you turn your chain on the side, you can see there's a ridge. This ridge where this loop sticks up, this is called the back loop, or the back hump. Sorry. So row 1, we're going to begin by working a single crochet into the second stitch from our hook. Insert your hook under that back hump. Then we're going to work a half double crochet into each of the next 2 chains. 1, 2. Now we're going to work a 2 double crochet cluster into the next chain. So we're going to yarn over, insert your hook into the back hump, yarn over and pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2 loops on your hook, yarn over again, insert your hook into the same stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2 loops on your hook. Now you'll have 3 loops on your hook, yarn over and pull through all 3 loops on your hook to complete the stitch. That's a 2 double crochet cluster. Then we're going to work a half double crochet into the next chain, a single crochet into each of the next 3. 1, 2, and 3. And you're going to repeat that across until you have 6 chains remaining. Well, in our case, with the swatch, we have 6 chains right away. Then we're going to work a half double crochet into each of the next 2 chains, a 2 double crochet cluster into the next chain, and then a single crochet, a half double crochet into the next chain, and a single crochet into each of the last 2 chains. And that's it. You've completed row 1. Now I'm going to put this down just to show you really quick. Zoom in a little bit. Now, a simple tip to help you keep track of your stitches, since we're going to be working in back loops only for this entire section, we're going to place a stitch marker into the front loop of the very first stitch of the row. So place it into the front loop, and then we're going to also place a stitch marker into the front loop of the last stitch that you worked for the row. Now what this does is it will help you mark the first and last stitches of each row, so when you turn your work you know where to begin and you know where to end. And then this front loop right here, when we turn our work, becomes the back loop of the stitch where you need to work into. So now the front loop becomes the back loop. And row 2, we're going to work in back loops all the way across. Let me zoom back out a little bit. Okay, so to begin row 2, we're going to chain 1 and turn. And then if you need to, tilt your work towards you a little bit so that you can see the top 2 loops. And you'll see that this is our first stitch of our row, and that stitch marker is holding the back loop, and that's the loop we need to work into. So now you can easily see the back loops. Now, some people, when working a row of slip stitches, they need to go up a hook size to help with tension. So if you need to, you can increase to a 6.5 millimeter. I usually stay with the same hook size, but when you're first starting with slip stitches, it is a good idea. Another short or easy trick is to gently pull up on the loop on your hook. This increases the size of the loop, so it's not the same size as a crochet hook, just a little larger, and that will help your tension. You don't want it to be a lot, still controllable, but just slightly bigger than your hook. And insert your hook into the back loop only of the first stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, and pull it right through the loop on your hook. Don't pull on this yarn at any time because you will tighten up the loop on your hook, and also the stitch you created. Okay, so again, you can lift slightly if you need to on the loop on your hook. Insert your hook into the back loop only of the next stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, and pull it directly through the loop on your hook. So when you're working these, it kind of drags. Once you get into a groove, you kind of drag your hook a little bit. Helps increase the size of the stitch. Now you want to make sure that your slip stitches, both loops of your slip stitches, are the same size as the stitch you're working into, or they can be just a little bit bigger. That's okay. But you don't want your slip stitches to be smaller than the stitches you're working into. Otherwise, when you go to work the next row, it's going to be hard and you're going to get frustrated because you're not going to be able to work into those stitches. They'll be too tight. So work a slip stitch into the back loop of each stitch across, and then when you get to the last stitch, you'll see that it's marked with a stitch marker. So go ahead and work that last slip stitch. Now we're going to move our stitch markers, and again we're going to place them in the front loop only of the first and the last stitches that we just completed. Now if it's easier for you, right after you work that first slip stitch, you can place your stitch marker. Once you've worked a few rows, you'll begin to be able to recognize those stitches a little easier. But when you're first starting out with slip stitches, use the stitch markers to help. They really do help a lot. So now that we've got a stitch marker into the front loop only of the first and last stitch, we can chain 1 and turn to begin row 3. Now this entire square is worked in the back loop only, so keep that in mind. Oops. My stitch marker slid there. So here's the first back loop of the stitch we need. Another thing you can do is make sure to tip your work towards you, because if you look at the stitches straight on, it's hard to see those back loops. Tilt your work so it's facing you so you can see those top loops perfectly. So for row 3, we begin with a slip stitch in the back loop of the first 4 stitches. So if you need to, work that first one, remove your stitch marker, and place it in the front loop of that first stitch. Okay, so we worked one slip stitch. Now we have 3 more to work. It's 2, 3, and 4. Now we're going to work a half double crochet into the back loop of the next stitch. We're going to work a 2 double crochet cluster, half double crochet into the back loop of the next stitch, and then we're going to repeat that across. So we work a slip stitch in the back loop of each of the next 4 stitches. Again, with these slip stitches, if you need to go up a hook size, you can, or just slightly drag them to make sure that your loop on your hook is a little bigger so your slip stitches aren't too tight. Then we have a half double crochet into the next, a 2 double crochet cluster into the back loop of the next stitch, and then we end our row with a half double crochet into the back loop of the next stitch. And that stitch should be clearly marked with your stitch marker. And we're going to move that stitch marker, place that in the front loop of that last half double crochet you worked. Now if you look here, you'll see that those row 2 repeats will create the ridge. This is a simple way to count the rows that you're on if you're not keeping track on paper, as you can count each slip stitch ridge, count by 2. So here's row 1, this ridge is row 2, this is row 3, and you'll see another ridge form to indicate row 4 after we complete row 4. So after your stitch markers are placed, we're going to chain 1 and turn, work row 4. Row 4 is just a repeat of row 2, which is back loop only, slip stitch in each stitch across. So tip your work towards you a little bit. You can see your top loops, you can see where your back loop begins, and you can see where you're supposed to end. And work a slip stitch in each back loop across. Again, make sure to be mindful of your tension. Slightly drag your crochet hook to increase the loop on your hook. Make sure that your slip stitches are the same size or bigger than these stitches you're working into from the previous row. Move your stitch markers, place them in the front loop only of the first and last stitches of the row. And you've got row 4 complete. Now we chain 1 and turn to begin row 5. You'll see that that next ridge has formed, so now you can count 2, 4, and you have 4 rows. We're going to work in the back loop only across. We work a half double crochet into the first stitch, and we're going to work a 2 double crochet cluster into the back loop of the next stitch, work a half double crochet into the back loop of the next stitch, and work a slip stitch in the back loop of each stitch across. Again, make sure your slip stitches are the same size or a tad bigger than the stitches you're working into. I'm going to work a half double crochet into the next, 2 double crochet cluster into the back loop of the next stitch, half double crochet into the back loop of the next stitch. As you're working, if you feel a little tension building in your working yarn, pull a little bit more from the ball that you're working from, or go ahead and just pick up and shake your pile of yarn to loosen it up a little. You want to make sure there's no tension on this yarn here, or that can greatly affect your gauge and the size of your stitches. So we're going to finish off row 5 with a back loop only, slip stitch in each of the next 4 stitches. And you'll know where that last stitch is again because you've got that stitch marker there. So now we're going to go ahead and move our stitch markers, place them in the front loop of the first and last stitch of the row. So for row 5, you've got one in the front loop in that first half double crochet and one in the last slip stitch. Now you've got row 5. Now you can still count by 2s even if you don't have another ridge. So you've got 2, 4, and then 5. You know that's just 1. So we've got 5 rows. Now, to finish your square, you repeat rows 2 through 5 until you have 28 rows, and then we'll work a final row, which is row 29. So go ahead and work rows 2 through 5, repeat rows 2 through 5 until you have 28. You zoom out just a tad and I'll show you how we count those. So here I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28. Okay, so you should be able to count up to 28, counting by 2s from the bottom, and then we'll work row 29. Go ahead and complete that, and I'll meet you back here to complete the last row of your center 8-inch square. Okay, you should have completed up through row 28 of your center 8-inch square, and I've got 12 inches for my square. I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. You should have marked the first and the last stitch of row 28 in the front loop only. Then we're going to chain 1 and turn and begin row 29. Again, we're still going to work in the back loop only. We're going to work a half double crochet in the first stitch, a 2 double crochet cluster in the back loop of the next stitch, half double crochet in each of the next 2 stitches, and a single crochet in each of the next 3. This row is a little bit different than the previous rows, kind of like the first row, so that the edges are a little more smooth. So then we're going to have a half double crochet into the next, 2 double crochet cluster into the next, half double crochet in each of the next 2, and a single crochet into the back loop only of each of the next 3 stitches. And that's it. Do not fasten off because we're going to work the section that's titled Prepare the Border, or Prepare the Edge for the Border. Okay, so do not fasten off your yarn. I'm going to go ahead and remove the stitch markers. If you'd like to use them for the preparing the border spot section, go ahead and grab a couple more so you'll have one for each corner. Now for preparing the border, we're going to work around the perimeter of your square. We're going to begin by chain 1 and rotate, and we're going to work a single crochet into the side of each row across. Now for the large square, you need to skip one of the rows. It could be any of them. I chose to skip one of these slip stitch ridges. It doesn't matter where you skip the stitch. I just need the stitch count over here to be different. Then we're going to chain 1. We're going to place a stitch marker in the chain 1 under corner. We're going to rotate, work a single crochet into the bottom of each stitch across of our foundation chain. Chain 1, place another stitch marker in that chain 1. It'll just help you mark that for later on. And then we're going to again work a single crochet into the side of each row across, skipping one of the slip stitch rows. Work another chain 1 at this corner, rotate and work a single crochet in each stitch across, and then join at the end and fasten off our yarn. And then we'll choose a different yarn for the border. Or if you use the same yarn, go ahead and fasten off, and then we'll pick back up for the border. So we're going to begin with the chain 1. We're going to rotate and we're going to work a single crochet into the side of each row, but skipping 1. I like to work right into the center of the stitches. Helps prevent gaps. I'm going to place a stitch marker into my chain 1 here and work a single crochet into the slip stitch ridge right in the middle and into the side of this half double crochet. And the next row is a slip stitch rows right down the middle of the ridge. Again, another slip stitch. So go ahead and work into the side of each row, but just skip one of those ridges. And we're going to chain one, rotate and put a single crochet into each stitch across the bottom of the foundation chain. I'm going to place a stitch marker into that chain one, the corner, and single crochet in each stitch across. And then we're going to create another chain one and begin working up the side of our rows. Place a stitch marker into that chain one and continue working a single crochet into the side of each row up the second side, and make sure to skip one of those rows of slip stitches. And then we're at the last corner, chain one, turn, work a single crochet into each stitch across, place a stitch marker in that last chain one you created. And then we're going to join with a slip stitch to that first chain one. I made mine a little bit too small, or I pulled on the yarn on my hook. Okay, so now you've prepared your square for the border. So you can go ahead and fasten off your yarn, weave in your ends, and I will meet you back and we will work the border. I forgot to mention that you should join your new yarn before you fasten off your old color. So after you join with the slip stitch at the end of the prepare the square for the border round, switch to your next color and then fasten off your old color. So now for on the border, the first round we're going to work a single crochet in the back loop of each stitch, but in each corner we're going to work a single crochet, chain one, single crochet. I'm going to remove my stitch marker here since I know where my chain one space is. And then the beginning of round one, we're going to chain one and work a single crochet, chain one, single crochet in that first corner. Now we're going to work into the back loop only, work a single crochet in the back loop only, each stitch across till you get to the next chain one space. That should be 28 single crochets for round 1 in between the corners. Now we're going to work a single crochet, chain 1, single crochet into the next chain 1 space. You can work it in the back loop if you'd like. I worked mine under both loops. So single crochet, chain 1, single crochet. Now we're going to work a single crochet into the back loop of each stitch across this bottom edge. All the way across to the next chain 1 space. Now if at any time that you find your border cinching inward or puckering, adjust your hook sides to accommodate for that. So if your border is cinching in, it's too tight, so go up a hook size. If it's becoming wavy, it's too loose, so you can go down a hook size or 2. Now we're at that next corner. We're going to work a single crochet, chain 1, single crochet. Oops. Work in the back loop only, single crochet into each stitch across to the next chain 1 space at the corner. Work another single crochet, chain 1, single crochet into that chain 1 space at the corner. Rotate and complete the round by working a single crochet into the back loop only of each stitch across. Now, I chose not to join my rounds with a slip stitch at the end. I chose to just use a scrap piece of yarn as a stitch marker or a round marker. So instead of joining at the end, I would place a piece of yarn between the first and last stitches of the round. That would mark the beginning and ending of a round for me. Another thing to note really quickly is if your stitch height is different than mine, my stitches tend to be shorter. I'm a little bit of a yanker. I ride and I yank on the yarn as I'm working. I keep the yarn here tight on my hook when I work most other stitches except for slip stitches, and I don't pull it up from the height of the row. So that makes my stitches a little bit shorter. So if your stitch height is larger than mine, you may find that you need to work less rounds of the border. You can stop working with rounds 3 or 4, or you can do 5, however many you need. Just make sure that your stitches you have the same number of stitches on all sides. There's notes in the pattern to go along with that. After we've completed round 1 and placed a scrap piece of yarn between the first and last stitches, we're going to begin round 2 and work a herringbone half double crochet and puff stitches. The herringbone half double crochets are worked into the back loop of the stitches, while the puff stitch, single crochet puff stitch, is going to be worked into the chain 1 spaces in the corners. So to work a herringbone half double crochet, we're going to yarn over, insert your hook into that back loop of the first stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, and pull that loop through the first loop on your hook. And we're going to yarn over again, pull through both loops to complete the stitch. Now when you're working the herringbone half double crochet, one tip I can give to you is to keep a finger on the loop on your hook to help keep it from stretching out too much and increasing the size of your stitch. I also have a very short video on my YouTube channel that has a couple other quick tips for working the herringbone half double crochet. So now we're at our first chain 1 space. We're going to work a puff stitch, chain 1, and a puff stitch in that chain 1 space at the corner. So to work a puff stitch, we're going to yarn over, insert our hook into that chain 1 space, yarn over, pull up a loop. When you pull up your loops, make sure you pull them up as high as the first loop on your hook. It'll make sure that these loops here are large enough for you to be able to complete the stitch. Now we have 3 loops. We yarn over again, insert our hook into the same chain 1 space, pull up a loop. Now we have 5 loops on our hook. Yarn over, insert your hook into that same chain 1 space one more time, yarn over, pull up a loop. We now have 7 loops on our hook. We're going to yarn over and pull through all 7 loops to complete the stitch. Then we're going to chain 1, and we're going to work 1 more puff stitch in that same chain 1 space at the corner. That's it. So now we have a puff stitch, chain 1, and a puff stitch at the corner. Now we're going to work a herringbone half double crochet into the back loop only of each stitch across until you get to the next chain 1 space. If you need to, use a stitch marker to mark those chain 1 spaces at the corner, or you can just fly by the seat of your pants, which is what I do. Okay, so herringbone half double crochet into the back loop, we yarn over, insert a hook into the back loop, yarn over, pull up a loop, pull that loop through the first loop on your hook, yarn over, pull through the remaining 2 loops. So you work a herringbone half double crochet into the back loop only of each stitch across to the next chain 1 space. And you should have 30 herringbone half double crochets in between each puff stitch, chain 1 puff stitch at the corners. Now we're at the next chain 1 space at the corner. This is what they look like up close. Little bumpy ridges. We're going to work a puff stitch, chain 1 puff stitch at the corner. We're going to chain 1, work another puff stitch. And then continue working a herringbone half double crochet into the back loop only of each stitch across to the next corner stitch, corner chain 1. I'm gonna let you finish that. I'm gonna finish it off camera. So work a herringbone half double crochet into the back loop only of each stitch across till the next chain 1 space. Work your puff stitch, chain 1 puff stitch, and continue all the way around. And you should end with a herringbone half double crochet into that last stitch before the scrappy yarn. Go ahead and complete round 2, and I'll pick back up here at round 3. Now you should have round 2 completed. Before we begin round 3, we're going to remove our stitch marker and replace it after the last stitch of round 2. You can also choose to join each round with a slip stitch and then begin with a chain 1 if you'd like. I preferred to work in a spiral or continuous round. So now the only thing difference between round 2 and round 3 is that we're going to be working our herringbone half double crochets under both loops, no more back loop only. So begin by working a herringbone half double crochet in each of the first 2 stitches. That second stitch is your first puff stitch. Then in that chain 1 space, we're going to work a puff stitch, chain 1 puff stitch, and then our next herringbone half double crochet goes into the next stitch, which is the next puff stitch. This top of this stitch can be hard to find. Sometimes it hides and you might have to move your work around. So now we're going to work a puff stitch, chain 1 puff stitch, and then another herringbone half double crochet in that next stitch, which is the puff stitch. Then we continue by working a herringbone half double crochet into each stitch across until you get to the next chain 1 space at the corner. And you can see the texture a little bit better of that herringbone half double crochet. So for round 3, go ahead and complete round 3 by working a herringbone half double crochet into each stitch around to the chain 1 space at the corner, work a puff stitch, chain 1 space at the corner, herringbone half double crochet into the next corner, all the way around your square until you reach the last stitch of the round. That's round 3. Rounds 4 and rounds 5 are just like round 3, except for your stitch count increases 2 on each side a little bit as you increase your square. Continue until your square reaches approximately 11.5 inches. It may mean you only work the first 3 rounds of the border if your stitch height is much greater than mine, and that's fine. So after you've worked the final herringbone half double crochet and puff stitch round, we're going to work a single crochet around to finish up the border. So continue on your square until it reaches approximately 11.5 inches, and I'll meet you back to work the last round. Now that this size of your square is roughly 11.5 inches, you're going to complete the square by working a single crochet into each stitch and chain across or around. Now I chose to only work 1 single crochet into the chain 1 space at the corner. You could work 2 or 3, however many you prefer. Just a personal preference. Just work a single crochet into each stitch around. So I worked 1 here, and that's what I worked in my final square. Some testers chose to work 2, some testers chose to work 3. Just a little personal preference. So after you complete that round, your square is done, and it's ready to assemble in your Afghan. I hope you've enjoyed making this square and learning a little bit more about slip stitch crochet. I hope I've made things a little less frustrating for you, but if not, you can reach out to me anytime on Facebook or at my email at jdpionk@yahoo.com. There's also a contact form on the bottom of my website at www.acrochetedsimplicity.com. Thanks for watching and have a great day.